This is what God calls us to. I know it's hard. I don't feel like returning good for evil. I want payback. Don't you? Don't tell me you don't. I know you do. You know, it wells up in your heart and it enters your mind before you can stop it. It's in us. Payback is in us. God says, my people don't live like that. My people honor me by returning good for evil. And Jesus is our example, verse 21. He suffered for us, leaving an example for us to follow. I love Eugene Peterson's paraphrase here. He says it this way: this is the kind of life you've been invited into, the kind of life lived, the kind of life Jesus lived. He suffered everything that came His way so you would know that it could be done and also know how to do it, step by step. Verse 22 and 23. Who committed no sin, Jesus, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in His mouth. And while being reviled, He did not revile in return. While suffering, He uttered no threats, but kept entrusting Himself to Him who judges righteously. God, as you've heard me say many, many times, is always doing a billion things all at once. We can never fully parse or even begin to parse all that God is doing in one event. But we know God is doing at least two things in the crucifixion of His Son. He is saving a people for Himself, and He is setting an example for us in how to suffer in a way that honors God. And I'm talking about persecution, suffering persecution. Christ's death, as we know, was a substitutionary atonement for us. He took our place and our punishment on the cross. Obviously, we cannot emulate Him or be like Him in that way, but we are called to be like Him in the way in which He suffered. There was no sin in His mouth. And when He was reviled, He did not revile in return. This is not rocket science. This is what God says. Are you willing to live like that? You know, man, when you've got that perfect comeback, isn't it sweet? You know, it's just sweet. You know, I've got that boom. Metaphorically, boom, sever their head. Right? There's a sweetness to that. There's a fallen, sinful sweetness to that. God says, my people don't live like that. My people do not live like that. They're like my Son. There is no sin in His mouth. He says, they are like my Son. We can't be sinless like Jesus. It's like I said to you earlier. The sin is in my heart and it wells up in my heart and it's in my mind almost before I can consciously stop it. Do you know what I'm talking about? But you know the one thing I can do? I can't be sinless like Jesus because my heart has sin in it. But you know what I can do? I can do what He did. I can shut up. Sometimes you just got to shut up, you know? Isn't that right? Just shut up. I don't care how justified you are, shut up. Let there be no sin in your mouth with your spouse, with your children, with your co-worker, your co-student, your fellow church member. Let there be no sin in your mouth. This is what God says to us. And I want you to remember, I know you know this. Jesus was falsely accused, He was slandered, He was abused for doing what was right. Worse, He was hit, He was spat upon, He was scourged, and He was crucified, and there was no sin in His mouth. It's never going to be that bad for you. It's never going to be that bad for me. And there was no sin in His mouth. I got to thinking about it as I was studying. I was thinking, how much more godly my orbit would be sometimes if I would just shut up. Can you relate to that? If I would just keep my mouth shut, it would be a much more godly environment sometimes. If I would just shut up and let there not be any sin in my mouth. Even when I'm unjustly attacked, just shut up. Just shut up. There's something even more laudable here than the fact that Jesus held his tongue. Those of you who are familiar with the Gospels, Jesus not only held his tongue, he used his tongue in an amazing way. Some of the things he said from the cross, many of you are thinking of them now. Luke 23:34. One of the things Jesus did with his tongue in the midst of the most unjust persecution that has ever been perpetrated in the cosmos. Remember what he said? Father, forgive them. He didn't just hold his tongue. He prayed for his persecutors. Beloved, this is how we're supposed to receive unjust suffering. The other thing Jesus did, you remember Luke 23:43? He was evangelistic. He told the criminal next to him, today you will be with me in paradise. He was still thinking about the souls of others. John 19:26, he was concerned for those around him as he spoke to Mary and John, woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother. He was in the midst of unjust suffering, but he wasn't self-absorbed and self-consumed. He was concerned about his mother in that moment. John 19:30, he was focused on completing his Father's work when he said, it is finished. Beloved, if you can remember those four things, next time you want to, blast somebody, remember this. Forgive, evangelize, make provision for others, and remember why you're here. Complete the mission for which you're here, to glorify Christ. Is it going to glorify Christ to, get a verbal response out there? Is that going to glorify Christ? No, it won't. And that's your mission. That's preeminently why you're here. It's to give testimony to who He is. Some of you are saying, wow, what if I could live like that? You say, Jim, Jesus was not only a man, He was God. I could never live like that. There is a biblical example of a man living like that. Can anybody think of who it is? There were probably more than one, but one came to my mind. Remember Stephen? He was just simply preaching the gospel. And as they stoned him to death, remember what he said? Lord, do not hold this sin against them. So we know a man can do it. It's not that we can't do it, it's that we really don't want to do it. I want to get payback. Man, I've got the best comeback. I want to use it. I want to inflict maximum pain with my words. Don't tell me you don't feel that. We all feel that in our fallenness. But beloved, God is calling us to be disciplined with our tongue. To be disciplined with our tongue. We just need to surrender to the third member of the triune God who indwells us, the Holy Spirit. We have the enabling. We have the power. We just need to submit and obey. God says, my children do not use their mouths to curse, but to bless. They do not return evil for evil, but return good for evil. So what is Christ's confidence in living like this? What is His theological foundation for building His life like this? It's there in the last half of verse 23. Look what He says. He uttered no threats, but kept what? Entrusting Himself to God. Can you entrust yourself to God? In the hard spot, in the persecution, in the trial, in the unjust offense, can you trust yourself to God? Jesus just entrusted Himself to the Lord. There's a few things we probably should point out here. I believe He's trusting in the sovereignty of God. He knows the suffering has come through the hand of His Father, and He receives it. And He seeks to honor His Father in it. Beloved, that's how we're to receive suffering. This is not bad luck. Suffering is not bad luck. It has passed through our Father's hands. He is a sovereign God. Satan is dog on a leash. He's trusting in the sovereignty of his Father. He knows his Father is going to work good in this. What is the good that came through the suffering of Jesus? Someone tell me. Your salvation. God is always, you can't always parse it and explain it, but God is always working good in your suffering. You say, Jim, I'm suffering right now and I can't see the good. You don't have to see the good. You entrust yourself to your Father who is sovereign and is doing a good thing in you. You don't have to understand it. The Bible, Christianity is not about understanding it. Christianity is about believing it and living it and trusting God who is sovereign. You may remember when we first got into 1 Peter, man, I couldn't get off this, but it made me think of this as I was thinking about these things. Persecution and trials do not come to the Christian because we're not loved. They come because we are loved. Because we are loved by God. Whom, Romans chapter 1 tells us, the world hates. Trials and persecutions do not come to the Christian because we've been forgotten, but because we are ever present in the mind and heart of God. Not because we've been forsaken, but because we've been chosen. Not because we've been not because we are neglected, but because we are elected. Not because we are abandoned, but because we are adopted. Our suffering has